Good to have you with us this evening for the press preview. It's our first look at tomorrow's front pages. And checking out the headlines with us tonight, Rachel Cunliffe, Senior Associate Editor of the New Statesman, who's joined by Harry Cole, the Political Editor of The Sun. They're going to be with us from now until just before midnight. Good to see you both. We'll chat in a moment after we've had a look at some of those front pages. Hunt for lost Titanic sub is how the Metro reports on the search for a missing tourist submersible, which was diving to view the famous wrecked liner on the bed of the Atlantic. A UK billionaire is amongst those on board. Let's show you the front of the Mail. Also pictures the Titanic, the missing sub and that missing businessman, Hamish Harding. The Express describes the rescue effort for the 5 people on board as a race against time. Same story, in fact, and the main item on the front of tomorrow's Telegraph. Harry's paper, The Sun, also makes it the lead item, Brit on lost sub to Titanic. The Guardian leads with tonight's Commons vote, backing the report that said Boris Johnson lied to Parliament over Partygate. Here's the FT leading with the growing pressure on homeowners from rising mortgage rates, along with the pressure also increasing on Rishi Sunak to do something about it. According to the Eye, the current high mortgage rates will stay that way for at least another 2 years. And just so that Boris Johnson isn't the only former PM taking flak at the moment, the Star turns its attention back on Liz Truss, who it once described as a wet lettuce, but she didn't find it funny, apparently. And don't forget, you can scan that QR code that you see on screen during the programme. Have a look at all the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you listen to us discussing them. And doing that with me tonight, Rachel Cunliffe and Harry Cole. All the front pages are highlighting this awful story which broke this afternoon about the lost submersible with a number of people on board going to have a look at the Titanic. Rachel, it's right to say this is a race against time. They've got about 96 hours worth of oxygen on board, and they've already been missing for quite some time.
Yes, it's the kind of story that you might imagine in a blockbuster thriller, only it's real. It's a submarine off the coast of Canada. They do trips to look at the wreckage of the Titanic. The cost of one of these trips is $250,000. So it's not just the kind of thing that you might pop on to do on your holiday. But it was meant to be an 8-hour submersive dive, and 1 hour and 45 minutes into that, they lost contact with the submarine. It's now been lost for more than 24 hours. And so you've got divers and rescue vessels that are desperately trying to locate this vessel. Unfortunately, it's really, really deep. It's several miles deep into the ocean. The ocean floor at that particular point is full of sort of deep trenches, and that's where the wreck of the Titanic is. There's virtually no light down there because you're so deep. And so locating anything in those kind of conditions is a real challenge. And obviously, as you say, the clock is ticking.
Yeah, front of the Daily Mail has that haunting picture of the wreck of the Titanic, and also a smaller picture, Harry, of the submersible that's gone to have a look at it. And on board, Hamish Harding, who is a very wealthy man, but he's also an adventurer, and also rather hauntingly, he posted a social media message saying how excited he was that a weather window had opened up, allowing this dive to take place.
Yeah, so I think it's actually down to something 2 hours now, if you take into account how long they have been missing. If you think how long it took to find the wreck of the Titanic, this is going to be a incredibly hard rescue mission. And as Rachel said, it does feel like something out of a sort of adventurer's film. I mean, this is not a mission without risk. The reason that it costs so much is it is an incredibly hard part of the world to reach. As a sort of a tourist, so to speak, as a rescue operation, it's going to be even tougher. So a very grim story, and a race against time, I don't think really does it justice. I think it's looking pretty bleak.
Yeah, that's the headline on the Daily Express: race against time to rescue Titanic sub. I suppose the final thought on this, Rachel, really is that it's on all the front pages, this story, and yet there's so much going on in the world. But I guess it's a sort of an example of a story that is so unusual that it merits big headlines.
Yeah, it's unusual for a number of reasons. One is the sort of risk involved. One is the fact that it's the Titanic, which is something that everyone's heard of and that kind of holds a particular place in our cultural narratives and cultural imagination. But I remember when the schoolboys in Thailand were trapped in a cave and the world was trying to work out how they were going to rescue them. That was also on the front pages virtually every day for several days in a row. So I think there is something about these big rescue missions that does capture something and warrant this kind of attention. And that's before you take into account that there is a British man on board, which obviously gives it a specifically UK angle for the interest as well.
Yeah, I was in Chile for the run up to the miners being rescued, and that's all anyone was talking about, wasn't it, for days on end? OK, let's turn our attention then to events back here. Harry, the front of the Guardian: Tories round on Johnson as MPs vote to approve Partygate report. There was some question about whether it would be nodded through or whether a vote would take place. A vote did happen. 354 MPs voting to endorse the report, 7 voting against it. There were cries of "Who are you?" weren't there in the House?
Indeed. In fact, one of the 7 that voted against it was Labour's chief whip, because in order to force a vote, someone has to shout oppose to sort of test the will of the House, they call it, before a division takes place. And Boris Johnson had made it very clear to his supporters: call off the dogs, he said, don't die in a ditch. Don't do this on my behalf. There's a foregone conclusion to this vote. It's going to go through with a whopping majority, not least because a couple of hundred Tories, it appears, have abstained, including the Prime Minister and most of the cabinet. So actually, 7 MPs voted against the Privileges Committee report, which obviously, as we've been talking about for what feels like many, many days now, was throwing the book at Boris Johnson. If he'd still been an MP, he would have been kicked out of the Commons for 90 days. He's in a slightly sort of pathetic, petty little gesture at the end of it. He's having his pass revoked, so he can't come into the House of Commons without a visitor's escort, which I don't imagine has quite had the impact that perhaps they thought it might have done when that little punishment was drawn up. But it really does show kind of how, weirdly, in the end, toothless the Commons actually could be, because Johnson's already gone. They've got their conclusion. There was many hours today of pretty obvious virtual signalling from lots of people who wanted to queue up to put the boot in, but the horse is already bolted, so to speak. So a fairly pointless day in the House of Commons that I suspect could have been wrapped up in about 20 minutes.
Well, pointless, Rachel, but also hugely symbolic.
I think symbolic, yes. I mean, Harry is right in that it was a Labour MP who forced the vote, clearly, because Labour wanted the numbers. They didn't just want it to be nodded through. They wanted it on record that 354 MPs voted to endorse the report, which is a majority of MPs in the House of Commons overall, and includes quite a high number of Conservatives, and that only 7, if you include the Labour MP, 7 voted against. And they wanted, I think, those MPs who were going to side with Boris Johnson to put it down and have their names on record. And hey, like I can see why you might want to have a list and force MPs to put their money where their mouth is and really go, are you going to walk through that division lobby? And obviously some did. Others didn't. I don't think Nadine Dorries is actually on the list of MPs who voted with Boris Johnson. I think she abstained, as indeed did a very high number of Tory MPs. But I think that's interesting, given that she claimed that she was going to resign and then hasn't yet resigned, so could technically have voted for that. And on the revoking of Johnson's parliamentary pass, I mean, Harry is absolutely right in that it is pretty petty. It's also quite obvious, reading the full report, that additional punishment was intended kind of as a signal, in part because of Johnson's behaviour when he got the draft of the report going sort of ballistic last Friday, as we saw, and briefing out all the details of it. That was seen as particularly disrespectful and holding Parliament in contempt. So that's why that additional punishment was added. And it does mean that he's going to find it quite difficult if he ever wants to do some casual lobbying work on the side, not being allowed into Parliament to chill out with his former colleagues without a visitor pass. I think that's pretty symbolic too.
There aren't many jobs, Harry, are there, where you can keep a pass after you've been effectively sacked? I mean, what would happen if the Sun, if God forbid you ever were made redundant, and you started turning up at work, waltzing around, going to the canteen, chatting to people?
Bring my sandwiches, pretend I've still got a job. No, fingers crossed that won't be happening anytime soon. Thank you. No, look, Parliament is not a normal workplace, is it? Though there's a unique sort of tradition that former MPs are allowed to sort of come and go. I think even their spouses are allowed access to the building as well. There's often, if you're a kind of senior politician, there is a sort of occasional ceremonial role that you get invited back for, but it is one of those slightly strange quirks about the building that actually, if you start to pull at the threads of it, you don't really understand why anyone's got it, but people just always have. And obviously, former MPs, Rachel was right, former MPs have got into trouble by having a few of those if they do end up becoming lobbyists. But I don't think Boris Johnson is going to be becoming a lobbyist when they seem to be stuffing his mouth with 250 grand a pop for one of his speeches. So as long as that lasts, and various other columns and books and the like, so I don't think he would need to be lobbying just yet. Okay. Not for policy anyway. Maybe for a change of prime minister.
Rachel, the other main story on many of the front pages is the mortgage crisis. The average two-year fixed rates have breached 6%. Front of the FT, and real pain for many homeowners.
Yeah, so 6% was the figure in December that kind of tipped it in, it sort of signified crisis point. And we're at that again now, which is a little bit terrifying for homeowners with mortgages, myself included. There are sort of renewed calls and increasingly loud calls on the government to sort of quote unquote do something about it and to help homeowners deal with this when they see their monthly payments shoot up. The problem is that the mortgage rate increases are because of Bank of England interest rate rises, which are what the government, a part of the government's plan to curb inflation. The idea is that if you have higher interest rates, then you'll have higher mortgage rates, you'll get less demand in the economy, and inflation will come down, which is obviously one of Rishi Sunak's key priorities and is a really sort of big economic challenge that impacts just about every aspect of our economy. So on the one hand, you've got the government saying, yeah, this is really painful, but we need it to happen in order to get inflation down, which is really important. And then on the other hand, you've got sort of lobbying for, but the government must do something to help people. If they do, though, they're kind of undermining the plan to stall inflation. So there are no good options here, and it's going to get very, very tricky.
Yeah, Harry, the front of the Telegraph talking about those comments by Michael Gove saying that 25-year fixed-rate mortgages could potentially help solve the crisis. I mean, it's much less devastating in other countries, isn't it? In France, you can get a 25-year mortgage at the moment for 3%. Why is it so bad here?
But there are high interest rates. It'd be unfair to say there aren't high interest rates around the West. America are starting to come. Well, it looks like it's peaked, but it is worse here, and the government are in real trouble here because 1.4 million people, it's estimated, are going to have to remortgage this year. And it turns out that mortgage holders are a pretty vocal and pretty active block of the electorate that take things pretty seriously and actually turn out to vote. And no government has ever won an election without having the support, the majority of mortgage holders. And at the moment, if you're looking at some of the polling done of them now, they're all going Labour's way. So a ticking time bomb for mortgage holders, a ticking time bomb for the government, this one. They'll be keen to try and blame Liz Truss for it, but actually those rates keep going up. And there's actually, as Rachel said, there's not a huge amount that actually they can do because the Bank of England is independent. They can make as much noise as they want about the bank, urging the Bank of England to take people into account. But we've got to a stage very quickly, actually, in a way that has been never unheard of before, that actually politicians, frontline politicians are openly saying there should be a sort of bailout for mortgage holders, which, sort of post-COVID, where the government stepped in on furlough and then they stepped in on energy prices. And then now there's calls for them to step in on mortgage prices. A, where's this money going to come from? And B, where does it stop? When does, it's basically a one-stop shop to a sort of universal basic income, I think is the inevitable conclusion of this. And that's, a lot of people didn't sign up for that. The other point I'd very quickly make on this is that there's been some wry smiles, I think, from renters who are hearing lots of mortgage payers say, well, more than a quarter of my income's now going to go on my mortgage. It's like, well, yes, anyone that's tried to rent in the last 10 years can tell you that's actually not bad compared to some of the statistics we've seen for the amount of money that people in the rental market have had to pay. So if you're going to bail out the mortgage market, prepare for a lot of very angry renters.
OK. Rachel, I'm going to do a slightly strange thing now and ask you to describe a story that's in The Sun, just because Harry had a long answer there.
Sorry, that's my fault.
I know, it's fine, it's fine. Just tell us about this this poll, Rachel, about the eco-elites.
Well, The Sun have done a poll of voters and how they feel about net zero, specifically how they feel about having to pay more for various things in order to reach our net zero target. And I'm going to pass on over to Harry to quickly, hopefully, say what he thinks it says, because I think it says something different, but I think he should get in there first.
Very quickly, it turns out that politicians are very out of touch with the public on this. 85% of the public say politicians, MPs that pass this legislation do not understand the pain that people are feeling, and they do not want to be the ones that have to carry the cow for this. They don't want to get rid of their boilers. They don't want to be forced to have electric cars, and they want things to slow down and cost of living to come first.
OK, that was very honourable, Rachel. Thank you. We'll give you lots more chance to speak.